themselves anymore, but oftentimes these statements and these tropes are incredibly harmful for folks. And I think, you know, it's easy for white folks to not know that they're doing it or that we're doing it, because again, we've been socialized to be sort of racist. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I did want to. Oh, sorry, Kate.
Oh, I was going to say that you have this amazing resource that I think would be super helpful to go through a little bit, because I think they just do a fantastic job at really extrapolating the nuances of both our misunderstandings around, like, a lot of times when people say things, what they think they're saying versus how the deeper implication. And then, yeah, I was thinking starting with that would be cool. And then maybe we could talk about, like, and how do you feel the situation when someone's like, hey, like, what you just said was messed up?
Yeah, I can share that PDF here in the chat for everybody. Is that the one you were referring to, Kate?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
We all did research this week, and Eden got MVP on research.
Yeah, I had actually, just to kind of share where I found this resource, a lot of times people who make like the really helpful graphics on like that come up on Facebook and Instagram, they'll cite their sources for like where they distilled some of this information down from. And that's actually how I found this one. So I just did want to like encourage folks, we've talked a little bit about this before, but if you're seeing like these really cool and like interesting graphics, like be curious about what studies those actually came from, and if you are like, looking for more in-depth resources about some of the things you're coming across online, it's really helpful to like just do a quick Google search of the source that that person is citing to make those graphics. So yeah, I think one thing I wanted to mention too is that that word micro can be like a little bit deceiving sometimes, in that we think like, oh, it's a small instance, therefore it's not super impactful. But one thing that NPR story that you had actually mentioned, Kate, talks about is that these like small everyday interpersonal interactions build up over time and like affect the psychology of folks and become like increasingly harmful as they like as folks continue to experience microaggressions or micro insults, and or even like macroaggressions, which are like outright or overtly racist, like intending harm. And I also think it's important to talk about like the difference between impact and intention, and maybe that's something we can kind of get into when we talk about like what happens when you're sort of maybe called out for engaging in microaggression, because a lot of times people think, well, I didn't mean it that way and therefore it wasn't harmful, and that's the, you know, you can not mean something and still it can still be true that it was harmful. And so I really like this resource. I think if it's kind of hard because we're not able to like have a back and forth with folks on the call, but if you are able to, if you're at your computer and are able to like pull up that document, I think we can kind of go through some of the ones that like that stuck out to us maybe.
Yeah. And I also think that's what's great about the document is it shows how, you know, microaggressions aren't specific to race. They're specific to any sort of situation where there's a majority group that carries a sense of a stereotypical narrative about a person and then reinforces that othering by behaviors. And also codes those behaviors in ways for them that are really different than how it feels to experience them. So I also really appreciate this document because it contextualizes all the ways that microaggressions can manifest.
Why don't I share my screen with that, and we can kind of talk it through from a visual standpoint.
Oh yeah, that's a really good. And if people have like questions or comments, they can feel free to drop those in the Q&A or in the chat if you feel like comfortable sharing with other folks as well.
Yeah, so this sort of breaks it down by, different tropes that seem to happen most frequently. A microaggression example of like, um, you know, not being white is, where are you from or where are you born? You speak English so well. Um, what are you? You're so interesting looking. I can't fathom saying that to anybody. But the theme is alien in one's own land, and sort of when Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and others who look different from, I would say, from white assumed culture, or are named differently from the dominant culture, they are assumed to be foreign born. So go ahead.
And I think on this is also something like, this is a great construct for understanding what we see in our opposition saying things like "Make America Great Again" or like "True Americans," right? Like the underlying idea is that true Americans are a particular kind of way that isn't Asian, isn't Black, is, so here I think it does a great job at showing the ways that we've internalized an idea about who belongs here, and the way that we project on people that we've perceived, mostly people who just aren't white, and therefore perceived as though they're not American.
Yeah, I think that like this one comes up to, and I think it might be a little bit further down in this document as well, but this comes up to with like pronunciation of names a lot. Like, can you, this is difficult for me to say, therefore, can you simply like give me an easier, like, do you have a nickname? Can you give me an easier, or even like assigning the person a nickname that is easy for you to pronounce, and instead of like making the effort to like correctly pronounce somebody's name. And I know I've seen this happen a lot, like living in Dearborn, for example, and that's like what the message behind that is, while it may feel like, oh, I would just like for us all to feel more comfortable, because you're going to be uncomfortable if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, I'm going to be uncomfortable if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Like the actual message behind that is like, please assimilate to dominant culture. Your name is hard for me, therefore please assimilate to something that's easy for me, rather than having some like uncomfortable and like position to be in. I think like we've talked a lot throughout these talks about like getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that's another one of those examples, is like, just try. I mean, I think like some people are so like afraid of like doing something or saying something incorrectly that they don't bother to try, and thereby therein like invalidating someone's like entire culture, right? Like that's their name. That's what they go by and have gone by their whole life. So I think that one is like, does have like a huge like othering impact, like either fall in line with the way that I talk, or be othered by demanding that your name be pronounced correctly, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there are ways to do this that, might be awkward at first, but like, you write down a way to say it phonetically to yourself, or, you make a note in your phone or something like that, so you have it saved so you can practice it. If it's I have a really difficult time saying French words. Like I can't pronounce French words at all. Like I can't do it. So like I have to, whenever I'm around French folks, like I have to like really work very hard. It's just something I have mental blocks for other reasons, but like this is just something that I have to work on, and it's something that in my phone, I'll write down somebody's name phonetically, or if it's a French word, I have to write it phonetically. I can't write it in French because I won't be able to pronounce it. So, it might be awkward at first, but I think if you remember that person's name and you can pronounce it the next time, like that's gonna, go really far, and really, take yourself out of the center of the conversation.
And it's also a moment to set our intentions, right? Where when you say to someone, hey, look, like your name's really difficult for me to pronounce, do you like have a nickname or you shorten it? The messaging really implies how important it is for you that they feel seen, right? But if you can just own like, hey, this is difficult for me, but I'm committed to making sure that I say your name correctly, you know, just a sense of like humility and transparency about an effort completely changes the dynamics that we have between one another. And also we're saying, I'm not saying like, oh, you don't belong here because I can't say your name. I'm saying like, I'm the problem, not you. And my problem is that it's challenging for me to say your name, but I make the commitment because I see you and respect you that I'm going to figure it out, and it might take me a minute. So when I fumble, don't let me say it wrong, or I'll say that to kids all the time. Don't let me say your name wrong. And you know, I'll just own it and check in with people.
Yeah, that's great. It's kind of placing the burden on us instead of on them, right? Which is give me something I can pronounce. There's also a bunch of really great ones around like gender stereotyping and that sort of thing that I think, you know, you're a girl, you don't have to be good at math. What's your age? Oh, you look for a ring on somebody's finger based on how old they are, or, you know, all of these sorts of things are just like means in which we've just been socially acclimatized to expect certain things from certain types of people. And it's really about breaking down stereotypes, right? I think it's really about like recognizing that groups of people, whether it's race or, you know, gender or sexual orientation, all of the, we've basically as a culture just like created monoliths that like, oh, you're part of this group, therefore I check this box in my brain. And it's really about like breaking that down and seeing people as individuals. And I think, you know, we've not been socialized to do that. But it's really easy. If you look somebody in the eye while you're speaking to them, you see them as an individual.
Which is also ironic because we as white people 100% are seen as individuals all the time, or never asked to speak on behalf of our entire race or group.
Right.
Kind of to speak to what you were talking about too, Anne, I think like a lot of times if people do have maybe like a bias or prejudice or you know, stereotype that comes up in their mind, and like maybe they recognize it as such and they kind of think, wow, that's like an ugly thing for me to have thought, and then like push it to the side, and maybe they don't act on it, right? But I think it's really important to like ask yourself, maybe when you have more time to like process where that came from, like where does that come from? Like, and not to, I think like the tendency for me in the past has been to say like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe this thought occurred to me. I'm embarrassed or ashamed of that, and I would like to push it off to the side. Whereas like in reality, to do the work of like reflection on that, it takes time to actually like go in a little bit deeper and say, wow, that is really ugly. And once you are able to like push into that, I think like you're able to see how ridiculous or like where historically that thought may have come from, and that recognition like sort of stops it in its tracks, because you're shedding light on like where this came from, and like that is what prevents it from happening, or like the thought from occurring again, I think. But whereas if you just kind of like push it aside and don't deal with it, then it's going to keep coming up for you, and you're going to keep feeling ashamed of it. You're going to keep feeling like, I don't know, I find myself like kind of constantly like coming back and saying like, where are my thought patterns coming from? Not just in terms of like racism, but even like my own internalized sexism, homophobia, like transphobia, things like that as well. So I think like that's been another underlying theme that we've had, is like examining our own thoughts and our own actions when we have the space to do so.
Yeah, I think that's such a great practice, and something that's been, I feel like that's something I've kind of like been really conscious of for a really long time, is that practice of just, examining where this comes from. And I think also for me, another thing that's been helpful is like meeting that narrative that you're having with a counter narrative of like, oh, look, a black guy driving through my neighborhood in a fancy car with a fancy watch on. And like, okay, first fucked up thought is this person's selling drugs. And then like, I can't believe I'm programmed to think that. This person's probably a doctor driving home to their family, or this person probably has their own small business and, you know, whatever. Or this person probably, I think like providing those counter narratives and reprogramming your mind is really helpful. I know that when I kind of first started this work, I noticed that when I was like walking near crowds of Black teenagers, I would have lots of fucked up thoughts that were not okay. And I really practiced like spending time in my mind around like, you've been programmed to think messed up things about these kids. Like, these kids are students. These kids are, and so now my head works really differently. And I feel completely different. But it's a practice. And I think it's a real acknowledgement that like all of us have been programmed to walk around thinking fucked up things. So to deprogram that, it's work.
I also think to add on to that a little bit, it might be like a really good practice to also like you're saying, like maybe he's a doctor driving home to his family. Think of like 10 things he could be, not
Right.
just like he could be a, you know, like pick a, you know, he could be a finance guy. He could own,
Right.
you know,
All the things.
his own business. He could be like, but just go crazy and just like use it as a thought experiment to see like, what does your brain go towards? Like, can you imagine a wealthy Black man being, you know, the owner of Lowe's? Can you see him being, you know, all of these things? Like, give yourself the opportunity to use your imagination. I think this is why the arts are so important, because like really like using your creative muscles to like reimagine what people can be in your white perspective or non-white perspective is like a really powerful tool that we don't ever use, and it really limits our ability to understand the world around us, I think.
And so important to notice, like when you clearly see a wealthy white person, you don't like tag a single narrative to them. You're like, oh, I don't know, they could be anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like noticing all of that is so useful.
Right. We've got a couple questions. I thought maybe we'd tackle the first one. When is it appropriate to step in when you see a microaggression happening? I know they're nuanced depending on the situation, but what is your experience with this?
I think it's appropriate to like have, I guess, like to have a one-on-one conversation with that person if like one, if you feel that that person is capable of like learning and growing from that, and to do that in a way that doesn't like do further harm to the person who's already now experienced a microaggression, right? Like sometimes I think I've seen people sort of do like a virtue signaling of like, I'm going to get really, like, I'm a white person, I'm going to get really mad at this other white person to, again, like distance myself from them and their like fucked up behavior, when in reality that doesn't, like the yelling or like getting angry or getting aggressive with that person isn't going to solve anything. It isn't going to like help that person to like learn and grow and do better for the next time, so that they don't like further perpetuate these aggressive behaviors onto someone else in the future. So like one thing that I have done like in my own personal experience is say like kind of wait till we're out of the situation and say like, hey, can I talk to you? I have some, like, do you have some time to like engage with a conversation with me? And I always like to start with like, this is coming from a place of love. Like I wouldn't be having this conversation with you if I didn't think you could do better. And then like just kind of delineate like factually what I saw and like how I think that could be harmful, and maybe even flag like, hey, I know you probably didn't mean it this way, right? Like microaggressions aren't generally intentional, but here's what the implication of that could be, here's the harm that could be a consequence of what you said or how you like reacted in this way. So that's sort of like, it is, you kind of ask like, is it a nuanced thing? It is, like, it depends on your context, your relationship with that person. There may be that it's like more overtly aggressive, and maybe there is a space to like step in and say, hey, like, let's walk away from this situation right now, because you feel that that will be like the most important intervention in the moment. But I do think it depends on like a person to person like interaction in the context of the situation.
Yeah, I think to that point, like there's a lot with, also showing up for people in the moment so that they're not feeling like, everybody in this space feels that way too. I think, like showing that you're able to support folks who are who are being marginalized in the moment, I feel like is a really, again, it has to be it's a nuanced situation, and it's obviously case by case. But there's another question on here. What are your thoughts on confronting someone who thinks a microaggression is a positive stereotype? Example, Asians are good at math, Black people are good at sports, etc. The usual response is, well, that's not a bad thing, so it's not racist. And I think it's about these stereotypes, right? It's like you're creating a monolith per culture. And I think like you can address those conversations with like, pick if the person is a white man, just be like, well, you must be good at football. Or, like kind of turn it back on them and just maybe like give an example where perhaps like they're not good at football and this about them, but you can call them on that and just be like, well, what, you're a white guy, and or, just like if you can be playful with it and kind of help people see like, oh, you kind of are in this space and you're perpetuating a stereotype that's maybe, well, all going to be harmful. Also, I think it doesn't always necessarily happen face to face with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Like it can often be like a side comment that, they say, and then it's much easier, I think, to call out because you're not necessarily creating more harm for that person. But for me, I think if the person that they're discussing isn't in the room or isn't there, I think direct conversation in that moment is really, really important.
Right. And depending on the relationship that you have with the person too, it's also, if you're seeing something that's going on at work or wherever, it's also a moment for you to just ask the person what they want for you to do. And that, hey, whatever you need, if I can be useful in a way to help make it right, like I got you.
Mm-hmm. We have a bunch of really good questions coming in.
Yeah, there's another one in the actual chat. I can read that one. It says, are the terms micro and macroaggressions only used to describe these biases and dangerous behaviors toward groups that are oppressed, i.e. Black, Indigenous and people of color, women, non-gender conforming folks, etc.? In short, are there such things as microaggressions aimed at, let's say, white cishet men? Or would you just not consider that a microaggression?
I mean, that's totally valid, right? Like my comment of like playing football is a microaggression. So maybe that's not the best course of action.
Except for that, I think it's one of those things though where you're asking a person who's never in the position of being part of a minority group to try on how it feels in a particular kind of way, right? Because ultimately, this is all a result of stereotypes and misunderstandings about one another by people who largely get to operate in the world as individuals. So, I think also if it's helpful to help, the person who does it to see that they aren't pigeonholed into identities projected onto them by majority groups. That's an important thing for people to understand. So like I suppose I could have some, I could project some bro-y idea on, Josh the white guy. But Josh the white guy's life isn't contoured every day in and out by majority group's perspectives on how it is that he should be showing up in the world.
Right. He's not walking into that luxury goods store being followed by the security guard. He's not being looked at funny, or people aren't sitting next to him because he's a white man at a diner. Like, his life isn't being defined by all of these elements that are just like perpetual and constant, but like unspoken.
Right.
And I think that's really where the harm comes, is like Eden was saying earlier, like that continuous harm that just goes unspoken and unaddressed by the masses. Like, that doesn't happen. I mean, it can happen to women, sure, but that doesn't typically happen to white cis men, right?
Right. And I think, and the other thing that's important for us to understand when we talk about like these things piling up, it takes up tremendous psychological space to be like, if Josh doesn't get the job, Josh is like, oh, there's better applicants than me. Whereas if you're a person and you're being, when people are experiencing microaggressions all day long, again, they're subtle. And so you're spending brain space thinking of like, wait, was this? Did you just because? And that it's really agitating. I mean, I know, again, I experience these things on a very minor scale just as a woman. And the agitation of like seeing what it feels like is going on, but spending time being like, is what I think going on? What's going on? Like, it messes with you. And so for that to be happening all day long,
it's exhausting. Yeah. It's fully exhausting.
It makes you feel crazy in a world that's telling you are crazy.
Right.
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say that the definition at the top of the document that we first shared with the chart says microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental, slight snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So I think that that's a really important part of that definition, is that this is due specifically to their marginalized group membership. So white cis man, like that, none of those three identities are marginalized identities. And so it's not that I don't think you could be aggressive or rude to a white guy, right? But like, I don't think you're doing it based on their status as a white man. And I don't think that, well, I know that they don't have like white men don't have the same real world repercussions that are a result of these widely accepted stereotypes in society.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a really important point. Right? Like, the world is basically, our culture is basically structured for white men as the dominant narrative of the culture. So yeah, their world is not necessarily, defined by how other people see them, because they're basically told that it's for them. There's another question in here, which is maybe slightly off topic, but I feel like it's something that I've been considering. In general, what are your thoughts on white people wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt or clothing depicting Black artists, activists, historic people? I don't necessarily know if that would be considered a microaggression, but, does that kind of, I think my thoughts on that kind of veer towards, is it performative? Is it not performative? Is it some sort of means of showing public support that you're, there for the cause? And that, I think, I don't know, I kind of go back and forth on that. I feel like sometimes it really is maybe context specific too, like where are you going?
Yeah, totally. And who are you? What's your relationship to those things? Right. There's not like a one, I think like you said, I think it's the context, your relationship to all those things informs how appropriate it is for you to be wearing, and supporting
Right.
and all those
Are
things.
you going to a protest? Wear the shirt. Are you like going to like your first black barbecue? Maybe you think twice. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's just really about like understanding your presence in the space too. Like, if like, don't be the kid who goes to the concert wearing the t-shirt. Do you know what I mean? Like,
You can't wear your Las Vegas shirt in Vegas.
yeah, exactly. So
I kind of think and am very wary of co-opting things. I think that there is, and what I mean by that, if anybody's like unfamiliar with that term, is like co-opting is where you take a movement like something like Black Lives Matter without having like a really deep understanding of like the context and not really showing up for that kind of a movement like regularly and being knowledgeable about it and being able to talk to people with knowledge about that and then using it for your own personal gain. I think like I've seen a really good example of this that I saw was a woman protesting at the Capitol with a sign that said "My body, my choice," and like she was protesting having to wear a mask, but she's co-opting the narrative of like pro-choice that has this historic, background and like tons of oppression, like tons of people who have died because they haven't had the ability to choose their like how to like whether or not they wanted to have a child. And so that woman is kind of like taking this whole historic movement for like pro-choice, like women's rights, right, and then using it for her own gains without understanding of that. So I feel like if you're gonna wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, you better have like a lot of historical understanding. In the event that someone comes and talks to you about that and thinks like, wow, this must be like an educational resource for me, right? Otherwise you're kind of, again, like maybe sort of being performative, doing what we see a lot of like capitalist industries now doing with their like statements without having any real tangible results. So I like err on the side of like no, but that's because I think it's going to take like a lifetime's worth of like engaging with this work in order to be that person who's not co-opting.
Mm-hmm. Do we see the question about the person yelling?
Yeah, do you want to explain that one?
Yeah. So I've been curious on your thoughts on how to, in a situation like this, two friends, a white Latinx woman and an Asian woman, experience a Black man calling them fucking white cunt bitches aggressively on the sidewalk in San Francisco. He came out of his home and was persistent in his commenting. How can a non-Black person respond to an interaction like that? I understand there's a lot of heat out there right now, but these women strive to be allies are actually POC. Could they have given some kind of indication to that man who appeared loose? He did appear lucid and not suffering from mental health episode. They were not the enemy. And yes, I understand they were experiencing what BIPOC experience all the time, like can a white or white passing woman put a fist up to show solidarity, or is that not okay? So to be honest, a lot of times in situations like this, wait, the question is, hold on here. What can a non-Black person, okay. So I think, to be honest, if I was in that situation as a white person, I can say that I would try to disarm it with humor and be like, actually, they're not the white bitches you're talking about, I am. And I think in some ways, like owning that people have the right to be angry. And, if the person seems like they're aggressive, obviously, like just give them some space. But if you're walking down the sidewalk and someone is engaging you in a way that like they have some anger, they're talking at you, I mean, I wouldn't yell back. I would totally be like, you know what, like, like I hear where you're coming from. You totally have every right to be mad. I just think that like we need to not be, if all the people are doing are yelling fucking white cunt bitches, and I mean not in a way that's abusive, but I do think that we can engage in people's justified anger if it seems like they want to engage in a way that's affirmative of like that people have every right to be angry. As far as like these two women who they're white passing and like that's partly why they're feeling the heat. I think probably it would look if I was them, it would look something like, this is what happens to you when you're white passing. We actually aren't white and are upset with the ways white people have disappointed us also. But yeah, again, this is all really nuanced stuff that, it depends on context, it depends on, the space that you're in. And like, it's not okay. I don't want to be suggesting that it's okay that women are being screamed at when they're walking down the street, but it's like, yes, and both, it's a lot of things. I don't know. Do you, Eden and Anna, have things to add?
Yeah, I think that one's tough because it also is gendered.
Right.
So there's like a position of at least perceived privilege in being white passing, but then there's also this is being like perpetuated by a man in a gendered world where you also fall into the position of oppressed as a woman. And so it is difficult. There's actually, I'm going to send a Bell Hooks quote that I really love that talks about, hold on, let me throw it in here. Talks about white women and then Black men both being in positions of privilege and oppression. And a lot of times what happens is they'll want to fall into the category that makes them feel most privileged over somebody else, rather than understanding that like our liberation is like collectively linked. We're trying to like assimilate to the white male dominant like patriarchal force in our country instead of like interlinking. And so this is one of my favorite quotes as like a white woman, like acknowledging like when I see myself going toward like whiteness because that's what gives me like this perceived sense of power. No, that's not the direction I want to head in. And it sounds like that man is like he's recognizing like both, right? His oppression as a Black man, but also like engaging in like a power struggle as a man over women. So I don't have like a good like answer, but I thought that this was like an appropriate like piece of literature from a really awesome Black feminist that I wanted to drop in here as well.
To that point, which, Bell Hooks is like an incredible writer. If you haven't read any of her stuff, you should. This is a really great one to start with. We just read this in our book club a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, just read all of her books. Just do all of her books. It just gives a perspective that you just can't have as somebody who has one element of power as, either a man or a white person or something else, talking about the intersection of both sexism and racism and the devastating effects that has on people is something to really spend time sitting with, because I think like folks can have an understanding of some type of oppression, but maybe not how that like stacks against people.
Right. And also I think a lot of times, Eden brought this up a little bit, this idea of like our intention versus the outcome. And I think a lot of times we think that like, well, if we affirm to a person what our intention was, then they'll realize that like what we said wasn't harmful. consistently, the more that we can come to these issues, and that like we're not the litmus test. The person who is on the receiving end of the microaggression, they're the person who gets to decide if this is harmful or offensive. And so you, as a person who has been asked to take responsibility from your behavior in some kind of way, there's nothing that's useful at all about trying to recontextualize what it is that you did so that you can prove like that it, because the intention wasn't harmful or because you don't think it's harmful. It doesn't matter. Yeah. You're not the person who gets to measure. And I think that, you know, with a lot of these kinds of things, if consistently we can relearn, know what? I don't get to measure in this moment. And move from there. And again, and we don't have to be experts. And I think that's another thing, like as white people, we've really been conditioned to believe that like we should know, or we should. And so in moments where we're vulnerable, I feel like we don't know, it's like, oh no, I need to prove to this person that like I do know and I am. Just being like, I didn't know. I'm like, owning our ignorance, owning we're a work in progress, owning that like we're fumbling, owning that I can't pronounce your damn name and I'm really trying and I said it wrong for the 6th frickin' time and I'm sorry, I see you. That humility, it matters so much.
It really does. Go ahead, Eden.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's, you know, we've not been trained to be humble. We've been trained to be right. And we've been trained to think that the way we see the world is the right way to see the world. And
the world is the way we see it.
Yes, exactly. And then when things have been framed so that we understand that the way that we see the world is incorrect or totally abusive, that's that step in that moment where you're like, I can forge through with what I think is the way things are, or you can sit and allow other people's experiences to matter, right? And I think like we've just been so brainwashed to be centered in everything, and our experiences and our understanding is like the only way, that the humility, to Kate's point, goes a really long way. And if you can show that you're learning and you're growing, like somebody still might be upset with you and you have to be fucking okay with that, but you also can be willing to say like, I'm working on this and I'm sorry and I see it and I understand it now. You know, and don't ask them to explain it to you. If you don't understand, just be like, I'm going to work on this and I'm going to do some work. But, you know, don't ask a Black person to explain this to you. Come back here and put it in the question and answer.
We need to see ourselves. I always kind of think about it as like being white. It's like you're confidently belligerent. It's like you're like very like totally blind of like lots of what's going on is completely different than what you think is going on. But you're like, what I think is going on is what's going on. So the more that we can like tone down our belligerence to be like, oh wait, I had on the white blinders again. Oh wait, the more that we can begin to believe that we have on the white blinders, then we actually begin to see, because then you start having a different kind of sensibility of the world.
Someone mentioned in the chat, I think it just got sent to us as panelists, but I did want to highlight it. It says, I think it's important to recognize how oppressive white women are towards Black men. The historical perception of a white woman's purity and a Black man's guilt / criminality, Emmett Till's death being one example. Yeah, that's absolutely real. That happens. I mean, we see the videos going viral of white women on the cell phone calling the police, and because she has that privilege, and her like, you know, the idea that like white women must be protected at all costs, her like she has a power to criminalize Black men in particular, and that happens over and over and over again. So I did want to like say thank you to the person who dropped that in there, because that's something that happens really, really regularly. And I think like is particularly important for anybody who does identify as a white woman on this call to think about like how do your actions or how do the people in your lives actions affect and potentially like ruin a person's entire life, because you hold that power, especially when you engage police officers. So thank you to the person who dropped that in here.
Yeah, don't be a Karen.
Yeah, don't do it.
And just the narrative, you know, white women are taught to internalize a narrative around like that we are fragile beings that the world wants to seduce. And so I think that also in terms of like internal coding, a lot of times discomfort is coded, or fear, again, fear that's a result of racism inside of us is coded as unsafe, being unsafe. And then we operate in ways that actually create real unsafety for other, like real dangerous situations for other people. But like, there's a million situations where we've gotten people killed, or, you know, the Central Park Five was a white jogger, you know, who felt comfortable with these kids going to prison for, this has happened tons. And also there's lots and lots of laws that were created, and they were created like as justification to protect white women. The original drug laws are all a result of when white people and black people started socializing together in jazz bars, they're cool black jazz musicians. And so white men were completely freaked out by the fact that white women were having sexual interest in these musicians. And so the marijuana first became illegal because white men used it as an excuse to take back their property, white women. So the idea was that if we criminalize marijuana, which was a drug being used in these jazz clubs, it was like a real push and a sense of like oppression of like what black men will not have access to white women. And the law was written as though it was protecting white women. And cocaine has similar origins of being made illegal.
I think if you're interested in learning more about this and like seeing the examples of this like throughout history, you can do a really quick Google search about white women's tears, and it just yields like tons and tons of results, articles, people who have experienced their own criminalization or their own silencing because a white woman cried and needed to be like cuddled essentially. And so I definitely like would encourage folks to like look into that as well.
Right. And is why it's so triggering for people of color to be in the presence of white women crying. So, you know, another like aspect of consideration, depending on, you know, where you find yourself processing intense things, as a white woman, be very cognizant of where you're crying, and if you're taking up space that's triggering other people, because there's a very real history of white women weaponizing crying.
Yeah, I mean, the woman in Central Park, I have no idea what her name was, but, you know, I don't know if you've all seen the video, but she basically calls the cops on a guy who is bird watching because he asked her to put her dog back on a leash, and you can hear her voice change. As soon as she gets connected to 911, she like gets like hysterical and like gets like, she just like totally builds this crazy emotional performance out of fucking nowhere because this guy was asking her to be a responsible citizen in a public park. And that just, you know, that's the weaponization of our privilege. And it's a horrible thing to do. I do want to note that I threw a bunch of links in the chat. The NPR link is a conversation between Kevin Nadal, the guy I was mentioning earlier, and you know, somebody from NPR talking about microaggressions. I did then link to his website because he has a bunch of books on microaggression. that I thought were really helpful. Kate then also shared the microaggressions.com, and that's just sort of like bubbles of like different examples of it, which is super helpful. And then the video that we shared at the beginning of the chat is the YouTube link. And then the document that we discussed earlier is at the very top of the chat. So before we sign off, grab those links, because as soon as we sign off, they're gone. But it is close to 9. There's another message, so we'll have a look at that. But yeah, if you guys have any final questions, but otherwise, maybe throw in the chats what you want us to talk about next week.
Oh yeah, do you have themes for next week?
Yeah, if you guys have stuff that you're struggling with, or things that you don't necessarily have all the answers to, or you know, we're super open to like letting you all guide sort of what we talk about. There's, you know, a lot to kind of uncover here. So yeah, share whatever you want in the chat with us on that. And we're really grateful to have all of you guys in attendance tonight. Or we'll pick something, that's fine.
Or we'll pick something.
We've been talking a lot about sort of maybe housing and redlining and sort of the history of you know, discouraging Black wealth and how that is sort of institutionalized. I know Kate and I do a lot of work around the criminal justice reform system, so we could talk about that. Eden actually does a lot of work around housing, I think, yes? Yeah, and also voter suppression and voter rights and voting rights. So she totally corrected me earlier this week because I posted something about how felons can't vote. She's like, felons can vote in Michigan. It's like,
yeah, it does depend, state by state.
State by state, yeah, absolutely.
But the link between white supremacy and capitalism, all of the things. So it sounds like we've got more talks to have, which is good. But yeah, there's a lot.
White supremacy and capitalism, they're married.
You can't, yeah, white supremacy doesn't exist without capitalism. It's a tool for that structure. We had a very lively debate in my house last night about capitalism.
Ooh.
Yep. This is a sweater. You pull one thread quickly, no shirt. There's no anti-racism and pro-capitalism.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I did want to mention the 3 of us are actually staying on. So if I kick you out, it's not because I don't want you here. It's because we're meeting afterward. But thanks to everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
I know. It looks like we had a lot of people want to talk capitalism, which is